Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for being here. My name is Margaret Ewing, and I'm the Horace W. Goldsmith Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. It's my great pleasure to introduce and be in conversation with Andrea Fraser on the occasion of her visit to Yale as the 2025 Happy and Bob Doran Artist in Residence at the Yale University Art Gallery in partnership with the Yale School of Art. Andrea Fraser is among the most consequential artists working today. Since the mid-1980s, she's worked in the realm of institutional critique, conducting careful research in order to investigate and reveal the ways in which organizations, groups, and individuals hold and wield power. Through performance, video, and in her writings, with careful research and through incisive and often humorous delivery, she's helped us to understand the unseen and unspoken interests and assumptions that run through the art world, its players, and its institutions. Fraser's work has been the subject of numerous solo exhibitions across the United States and Europe, including at the Hammer Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Whitney Museum, MUAC in Mexico City, and MACRA in Barcelona, the Museum der Moderne in Salzburg, the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, the Kunstverein in Hamburg, and just opening last week at the Zaketa in Warsaw. She's been on the faculty at UCLA since 2006, where she's mentored a generation of artists. Many of you have had the opportunity to see Fraser's video. This meeting is being recorded in this space over the last 2 days. It's a piece made in 2001. It's a feature-length video based on research that she conducted in 2020 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. The piece uses a methodology called group relations, with which Fraser has been involved for 20 years, and which convenes groups of people to explore the unconscious dynamics of groups. Turning to this approach as a means to grapple with the urgent and complex questions around race, power, privilege, and white supremacy that flooded the country in the second half of 2020, she convened a group of 7 white women, including herself, for a series of 6 conversations over Zoom. Those 9 hours of discussion were condensed and lightly edited into the 99-minute video, which Fraser performed in a single take. Bringing this piece to Yale has been in the making for 2 years, and there are several people who were crucial to making it happen. I'm very grateful to A.L. Steiner and Ben Weathers at the School of Art, Michael Ibsen at the Yale Center for British Art, Andres Garces at the Yale University Art Gallery, and Diane Brown at the Humanities Center. Thank you also to the Yale School of Art for co-sponsoring Andrea's residency this week. Andrea has only done a couple of post-screening conversations about this piece, which makes it feel especially fortunate to have her here with us today. I'm really excited about our discussion, as well as to hearing questions and comments from all of you. For that. So please join me in welcoming Andrea Fraser. So, sorry, I'm just trying to keep my jacket from winding anyway. It would be great, I think, to start with, we're going to focus on the piece today, so on this meeting is being recorded. And we were joking before, but what were you thinking? What were you thinking when you started this? First of all, I want to thank Margaret for really bringing together a long-term commitment to bringing this piece here to Yale, working with the challenges of doing that. And we're thankful so much for that. And A.L. Steiner for in collaboration in that process with the School of Art, and also organizing meeting the students here, which has been great. Thank you all for coming. What was I thinking? Yeah. Well, the context for the development of this meeting is being recorded was in 2020. I was department chair at UCLA,
I was also the president of the board of a group relations organization on the West Coast. I was also on a couple of other artist councils and boards, and in these leadership roles, attempting to kind of take on an examination of white supremacy in some of those organizations, and in some cases in the position of trying to lead and develop and lead a program of action against white racism, white supremacy, racism, and bias in those organizations, and I found myself just feeling tremendously anxious.
Yeah, tremendously anxious, and that anxiety getting in the way of the work that I wanted to do in those organizations. Really, I did not expect this at all, but whatever. And on the one hand, part of the program that we were trying to develop at UCLA, which was true in a lot of organizations, was to include some form of anti-racist, anti-bias training.
And so that was a question of what kinds of trainings are out there. And what kind of trainings would help me in this situation with the anxiety that I'm feeling, which I also recognize as being a kind of manifestation of racism in myself. And I have some experience with anti-racist trainings. I've done a few. The Undoing Racism workshop with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond from New Orleans. That's one of the older ones. With Crossroads, that's also been around for a long time in Chicago. Also done anti-racism and anti-bias trainings in the framework of UCLA. And my experience with the sort of processes that were out there, that they kind of fell into two categories. One was political education, and those were often framed as white anti-racist affinity groups oriented toward political education and potentially political action. The other category I think of in terms of the kind of cognitive behavioral social psychology was the neuroscience mixed in, which is more typical of organizations and corporations, and was what I experienced at UCLA in kind of anti-bias trainings, and these are often mostly depoliticized. But neither of those trainings, while they were helpful, helped me with this anxiety I was experiencing. And so I started thinking about what other methods, and my experiences with group relations came to mind. And maybe we'll talk more about group relations. But that was the context. That's what I was thinking initially when I convened this group of 7 white women, which was an intergenerational group of 7 white women, all of whom had background in group relations. And we came together with the task of examining our internal racism and our roles in white supremacy as white women, and with the idea that we would apply aspects of group relations methods to that work. And group relations came out of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis mixed with sort of systems theory developed in the UK in the 1950s, but could be understood sort of broadly, I think, within the framework of psychodynamic psychology, so psychoanalytic psychodynamic.
And this was something that you've been involved with for a long time.
Well, at that point for about 15 years. And the basic kind of group relations is a theory and practice of exploring and understanding the unconscious and emotional dynamics of groups and organizations and services. And in practice, it's an experiential learning and sort of research model. And the basic framework are conferences in which there are no lectures or panel discussions, just groups of different sorts that you enter into. And the primary task is to reflect on and try to learn from and understand the unconscious and emotional dynamics of those groups as they emerge in the here and now. And they're incredibly fraught. They can be traumatizing. They're very intense, often. And there's a history in that work in the United States, especially, of looking at, also examining the intersections of those unconscious and emotional dynamics with social identity, particularly in terms of the roles that people get pulled into in groups and how those roles are often sort of determined by social, by gender, by race, by age, to some extent by class and education. So that was a resource for me. And so that's part of why I thought to go in that direction.
And how did you put this group together? How did you find the participants?
All six of the other women, 5 of the 6 I had actually worked with on staff in the conference because I am a certified group relations consultant in this method, in fact. And one I did not know, I knew sort of at Zoom meetings. And I sort of reached out one by one. Okay, at the same time, the Hammer Museum, I had committed to developing some kind of new performance work for the Hammer Museum, so this was up on. So as I reached out to these women, I reached out to each woman in a slightly different way, depending on my relationship with that person. But the first woman I reached out to was a woman who had been involved, I'm not going to go into this, but had been involved in a kind of collaboration with an artist that worked out very badly from her perspective. And so she was the first person that I talked to because I wanted to work through with her what the issues were in her experience and sort of the ethics of the collaboration and of and asking women to record the meetings. So, and there were 2 sets of agreements. So initially, there was only an agreement to record the meetings. And I recorded the meetings and I distributed the recordings, and when I transcribed the recordings, I distributed those transcripts to everyone. So we treated this as collective property, not property, but research, that we all had access to use as we might, but not to distribute. And it was only after the last meeting, when we stopped meeting, that then I asked the group whether they would give me permission to work with the material. And they did. So that was a 2-step process. And it was very important to me to separate those 2. And I wasn't at all certain that the women would agree at that point.
So I really think just to describe the piece a little bit more, maybe for
How many people did
see it.
Okay, quite a few of you saw it. Thank you for.
So we see you going in and out of these 7 different characters, one of which is yourself. And each person is just sort of shared. It starts out with silence, basically, right? And it seems like the process of just sort of waiting for the first person to say something.
Yeah, well, it's on Zoom, so it starts with, this meeting is being recorded, which you was here, we still here, right? And I have that in there. And then it actually starts in an interruption, as if it was just turning on the recording, just turning it on. But so the piece is, so there would be these 9 hours of recordings and 100 and some pages of transcripts, and over the course of a number of months, I sort of spent a lot of time working through those transcripts and also analyzing what was going on, and edited that down. And mostly it's in sequence. there were some shifts in sequence, but so I edited the material together as if it were one reading instead of 9. So it's a significant sort of condensation, compression of what unfolded. And there were certain aspects of what unfolded that couldn't be represented in that way. So that was, and then I memorized the 10,000 word script. That took about 6 weeks. And then I choreographed it, and it's choreographed in detail. And I rehearsed it for another 6 weeks or more. And then I shot it in one take to the camera, and I'm performing to the camera. But part of the choreography was working out where everyone was sitting. So I'm performing 7 women, but I'm just sitting in a chair. And so each of those women has a particular way of sitting, and there's an order to how we're sitting. So when I'm one woman, if I'm looking at, I know who I'm looking at, if I'm looking here or there. So that all has to be choreographed. It was quite complex. And then it was very important to me, the way that it was shot, that I could perform directly to the camera. And it can't be a live performance, because in this situation, I can look at you, I can look at you, I can look at you, I can look at you. But when you perform to camera, I'm looking into the eyes of every member of the audience, regardless of where you're sitting. And that can only happen through a lens. And that was very important to me, to sort of try to limit to try to bring the viewer into the group, and to limit, or to at least challenge what might be a sort of tendency to try to put yourself outside of the state and to become sort of a waiter. So I was trying to eliminate the position of a waiter and put the viewer in a very position. And it's projected life size vertically. So that's also in the situation in a museum is installed differently here or in a gallery, is there would be 6 chairs. I have a circle of 6 chairs, the same chair that I'm sitting in. So it's sort of literalized that you as a viewer joining the group. And it's projected life size to create kind of an effect of the presence of a person.
When I first saw it, which was early 2023 at Mary Goodman in New York, one of the things that I was really drawn to about it was that it made me really comfortable. And I thought, great, let's make some more people uncomfortable. But I think, of course, every viewer is going to have a very different experience, and I related to a lot of what I heard, and another viewer would probably really not relate, or and then I'm wondering, to what degree were you thinking about who the viewer would be? Is it directed to a particular viewer?
That's usually something I think a lot about, and I actually cannot recall thinking about that, except white women. In a certain way, that's the viewer that's constructed. That's the viewing position that is constructed.
I read that when you were first developing the piece, I think you shared transcripts of conversations with a group at the AMRA, the DEI committee, or...
Yeah, so they have a museum where I'm on the Artist Council. They have an Artist Council. They also have a DEI group that's an internal kind of cross-department, that's sort of cross-hierarchical group that looks at, considers equity, diversity, and inclusion issues within the museum. And then, then engages with leadership about those issues. And so, I requested that the script be provided to this group for feedback. And it was pretty negative, the feedback. And that did lead to some changes. I did take some of that feedback into account and made some changes in the script. I kind of wish that I got a little bit further in some of those changes. And it had to do with, it was my interpretation of the feedback, because it wasn't all that specific. Mm-hmm. And I also presented it to a group. Within group relations, there had been a group of, well, I didn't present it to that group, but there had been a group of white men who were meeting within the group relations community to engage with racism and white supremacy. And then there was a Latinx group that, I'm not sure what the agenda of the Latinx group was, besides sort of having a kind of a frayed place for Latinx people within that community. And I did meet with them, and they read the script. And the response was also quite negative.
Are there specific types of changes that you made, or what did you respond to? Criticism.
And I think it's still my criticism of the piece, and it has to do with my sort of sense of obligation or commitment or loyalty or to the group and the process, and to kind of follow the process that we went through. And because that process was not always a task of examining our internal racism and our roles in white supremacy, I think part of the response to the piece was a frustration with the sense that we weren't on that task, that we weren't really, my interpretation though is that we were, but in ways that had to go through our own dynamics. And, I can offer kind of analysis in that. So so I did kind of refocus it on the basis of
there are certainly a number of instances in the video that are, cringy, or sort of, you wish somebody wasn't saying what they're saying, or I do, or it's embarrassing, or it's, how could they be saying that? But then one of the things I really like about the piece is that the conversations are being had. You're showing that you've provoked this conversation, or you've created the opportunity for these conversations. People are participating, they've agreed to be recorded, and have agreed to be public through the piece. Yeah, and I think about, I know you did a conversation with Claudia Rankin about this piece a year ago or so, 2 years ago. And she's someone who talks about the importance of having difficult conversations. And I think that, it's sort of permission, or it's an example of having imperfect conversations, or speaking imperfectly, and not sort of having it figured out. It's enacting the process of trying to figure out how to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, kind of going back to my understanding of, say, a psychodynamic approach in distinction to a political education or kind of cognitive behavioral approach. And I'm going to try to not get sort of too confused with my own argument here, but and where to start? There is, okay, just to say it, from my perspective, a central component of white supremacy has to do with self-mastery. It has to do with self-mastery, it has to do with the control of the self. That is embedded in the constructions of freedom in the United States, and the constructions of freedom as white privilege against slavery. And So my experience of a lot of anti-racist discourse in a certain way, not discourse, but these kinds of trainings, is that they're about a kind of self-mastery. You know, through an intellectual understanding, an intellectual process, through a sort of self-monitoring of bias and behavior. And to fail in self-mastery within those frameworks is a source of shame and anxiety. But in that structure, there is a kind of an enactment of a central aspect of white supremacy, which is this need to control oneself, to be in control of oneself, to have to be a sort of, and a lot of the anxiety, I think, that comes up for white people around anti-racist work is when, oh, that's a microaggression. What? I didn't know I did that. What was it? I didn't do that. You know, it's being out of control. It's the sort of the anxiety and the shame and potentially the guilt of saying things or doing things and not realizing you're doing it. They're unconscious, they're implicit, and not feeling like you're in control. And that is not only, a kind of defense against sort of anti-racist, feedback, but from my perspective, it's actually kind of a component of white supremacy, right? And so the shame, the kind of hiding, it's all the sort of defensive mechanisms and defensive structures that are sort of built up, to sort of protect oneself against that loss of control, against that kind of experience of being confronted with your unconscious and not knowing and not, maybe I'm repeating that word too much, but I do feel it's fundamental. And so, doing sort of psychodynamic work or psychoanalytic work, the sort of fundamental premise there is that we have an unconscious that we're not in control of. We have unconscious impulses and fantasies that are having a lot of, influence on our behavior. And I think there's part of the process that, of accepting that. And for me, actually, that acceptance, not to say that there isn't a lot of, racism and white supremacy, for example, in the psychoanalytic community, but I still feel like this is a kind of an important piece of working through internal racism and the kinds of defensive mechanisms and structures that sustain it. And that advance us. So, going back to your question, because I kind of like talking around it, but, and I do feel like that's something that group relations kind of help me with, because in group relations, you're sort of like doing psychoanalysis in public. You're in a group and you're confronted with your projections, you're confronted with unconscious fantasies that are emerging, that you didn't realize are emerging. And the task that you set to is to relate to all of that with a kind of curiosity, which is quite difficult, or with an openness, or to sort of try to witness yourself, try to observe yourself in the process of those things emerging. And part of that is getting over the sort of anxiety and shame of that. And so, but of course we still in it, But I think because of the background of group relations, I don't think people maybe coming from another arena would maybe agree to do that, maybe in public, that there is this kind of sense, well, this is research, and it's of value as such, even if it's more defined.
Did it change to do group relations on Zoom?
Well, during COVID, there were group relations conferences on Zoom, and they were almost just as intense as the face-to-face ones. So actually, Zoom did not diminish that. In fact, it created even more kind of a paranoid situation. But we didn't actually do, I mean, it's not group relations. There are group relations, sort of aspects of group relations, and I think, but there were significant differences from group relations that I don't think I'll go into because they're quite too technical. But that definitely had an impact on what had happened. You sort of like create the group in a different kind of group, but in the viewing experience, you would have us sitting in chairs and probably with other people and with your direct gaze, but we're also aware of sitting with each other. Is that something you thought about with like sort of creating this viewing experience of bringing people into a collective situation? Yeah, I think that if as a viewer you kind of are getting kind of sucked into it, and then, but then, what am I trying to say? Yeah, I mean, I think part of the sort of publicness, hopefully, is not just that we're making this thing that is usually not exposed public, but also that the viewing of it is in public space. And I'm trying to, with the video, this kind of holographic projection sort of life-size thing, I'm trying to sort of capture what might be a sort of intersubjective or interpersonal, a sense of an encounter with a person, or in this case, a set of people, but also that is in the context of other people, and I don't know. I mean, I've heard kind of reports that people sort of then become sort of more aware than usual of what the people around them are doing and how they're responding, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So, and I think because there's a limit to what, and it is important that it's important that it's interpersonal, it's important that it's subjective, it's important that it's public. Because there's a limit to what you can do on your own, there's a limit to what you do in private.
I think I might just pose one more question and then open it up to questions from everyone else. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about showing this piece in 2025. And how, when I thought, first, as I said, we've been talking about doing this for 2 years, so 2023 felt like a lot closer to 2020 than this does now. I sort of wondered if doing it now, what would it be like? Would it feel dated in some way? Are we in this, how different place are we in? I sort of landed in, it's not right with regard to this piece of these conversations.
Well, except they're being outlawed. I mean, basically DEI and with the kind of, especially organizational initiative that I was working on, that people were working on within organizations, in 2021. And outside of organizations, a lot of people engaging in groups of different kinds. But within organizations, I think it's very clear that the Trump administration is basically trying to outlaw anti-racist work in organizations. And so, awful. And yet, well, if the presence of this piece as a record, I mean, the piece is also in many ways, it is a kind of record, of that moment. Mm-hmm. And so, a moment that is now being repressed.
I just think of it on two levels. I think of, the larger context and the political, what's happening politically, but also just the nature of the conversations and the small group conversations, and has the conversation shifted, or has the way in which those characters speak, would that, how different would it be now? And I think,
I think that's a question. Yes. And how they feel sort of one way. I don't know, I can't answer that.
well, I would love to hear what questions there are in the audience. I think there's Sarah has a microphone. So, please feel free to raise your hand. if you've got a question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's amazing. I'm a sophomore in Soleil, and I have two questions. You could answer one or neither or both. The first one is, what were the responses of the women who you could portray? And I'm curious about how they reacted to the sort of repossession of their image. And then my other question is about the title of the piece, because it immediately kind of suggests this surveillance state. And throughout the video, the women are responding to kind of their subconscious feelings about, being excluded or included in the space. And I wonder if you could speak about the feeling of being recorded or surveilled as it relates to, I guess, gesture and how you went about creating the characters as you were kind of monitoring your own behavior simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you. So the response of the women, I didn't get a response from women. A few came to see it. A few I saw it with them. And there was one woman, so I only had them from here up. So I was inventing. There's one woman that was just going to sit like that. I never said to sit like that. And then she came to see it with her daughter, and her daughter said, "You got her so good." I said, "Really?" So no, she listens. So that was, that was fun. I think so. I'm not sure what's sort of underlying your question of whether there's a sense that maybe they would be uncomfortable with how I'm representing them. And it was, so their age becomes quite a significant issue in the group. For those of you who watched it, and there are a lot of different ways to think about that, but in terms of sort of group dynamics, that groups come together with a tremendous amount of anxiety. And theoretically, a sort of massive regression. And a lot of that anxiety is about the presence of people who are not you. So difference on that basic level, not me. And of course, the more different, potentially the more anxiety. And so you think, oh, this is a homogenous group, it's all white women. Where's the difference? Where's the anxiety? Well, a lot of that was in age differences. So a lot of the dynamics that might have gone in other directions if it were a mixed gender group or a mixed race group went toward age, but age also holds this other set of dynamics, especially among women, of mother-daughter transcripts dynamics that were present from the very beginning. Give you the whole psychoanalysis of the sequence. But anyway, so for me, I've done multi-voice performances for a long time, and I did one performance in New Orleans at a city council hearing when I was performing 20 people, half black, half white, mostly men, all different ages. And I've done other performances, another piece where I'm performing for men, So I've done this, but this was a particular challenge for me at the moment that I was doing it, performing different ages. And I was very aware of my anxiety of being able to pull off performing a 35-year-old as a 55-year-old person. And I do think that that produced an effect in the performance that is in the performance. So I just think of performance as that I'm not performing other people, I'm performing a relationship or a set of relationships to other people. And in that, there is also an enactment of group dynamics that have been internalized. But those relations might be relations of identification, they might be relations of envy, which emerged in the group, they might be relations of aggression. So all of those were, all of those things were present in the group and in my relations to the group. And they emerged differently. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I'm interpreting the question. Okay, surveillance. Yeah, it's creepy. This meeting is being recorded. And I don't know what to say about that, except it links in my mind to the sense of self-surveillance, which I think is also kind of part of the method. And it also links to the problematic of the superego. And one of the dynamics I think that happens in a certain kind of white racism, of the projection of a punitive superego onto people of color, onto racialized people. And that was something that came up in the group. And so I don't know how to link it directly to the idea of the surveillance state, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, well, I think my question was the same. How did you respond?
And
There's someone here.
Well, actually, you had your hand up right at the beginning. I think you're.
Okay, I'll choose the mic anyway. So I'm like an actor in drama school, and so I would say like
you're what?
an actor in the drama school.
Okay, I heard drama school.
It's like you're
You're an actor in the drama school.
and I just
Great.
thought your performance was terrific,
Thank you.
and I was wondering if you like had like acting training, or like you had worked with like any theater people, like like Anna DeVere Smith, like does a lot of interviewing and then portraying. And like stuff like accent work, and because I know I'm from the Midwest, and like it was very nice to hear that older lady. And then I felt a lot of empathy for her too. As like growing around a lot of other ladies around like her, I thought you gave a lot of empathy towards her. I guess it's two questions. The acting question. The second question is like in portrayal of these. When you were in this doing it in the group, you clearly had a different perspective. But once you like became those people, what changed? How did it change? What did you learn?
Great questions. I did a little acting in high school,
And actually, I read Stanislavski way before I read Brecht, which of course is central to all artistic practices of, critique in a certain way, and had kind of internalized aspects of that. But also kind of connected to my long-standing interest in psychology, psychoanalysis. And but I love smart things, but I'm trying to contain myself. So a lot of, traditionally sort of, there's this like debate about empathy in acting in particular, and the pro-empathy, method, naturalistic, the Stanislavski system is understood as operating through empathy. And then there's the sort of Brechtian and Ballalian anti-empathy positions. And I am reaching, I feel like it's there. It's about, that's part of the process. Empathy psychoanalytically is a form of projection. So, but I also think of the way that I work as being about internalization, introjection, more than projection in a certain way. That for me, it's kind of like the whole process of memorization, which for me is primary, not secondary as it is in those methods. It's primary, is about internalizing. And then with that process of internalization, understanding that also then as being in kind of constructing an internal, this sort of multi-voice internal world of relations that are then like being, I'm embodying. But with that, never worked with a director. I don't rehearse. I didn't even rehearse in front of a mirror until like the last couple of days before I shot, because I wanted to stay in journal. And somehow that is part of how it works. It feels like it works. Wait, there was another question. There was another part of the question. What did I learn? Okay, that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Because, and I went through the script, and I analyzed the script, and I spent so much time with the script, I memorized the script. But when it came to rehearsing it and performing it, something else happened, which was fascinating, which was that I had to, and it was like a scene, like performing a scene, that I had to have a kind of understanding on some level of what was in the silences, of when one person said one thing and then someone said something else, often it's not related. There's not a response, but it is related. Because what this person said is somehow activating something in another person, triggering something, and then that's what's emerging. So that is something that I only kind of got to in the process of rehearsing. And there was this whole other level to the content, to the material that I sort of discovered in that process. That was super enriching.
Do you rehearse in front of anyone? No. And do you film in front of anyone? Is there anybody behind the camera or?
You're in a booth. And I actually memorized while I'm walking. There's something about the embodiment, talking to myself.
I would like to ask you something about. Hi. I wanted to ask you two things about I keep thinking about the cringy moments of the person with somebody, right? Because I think that there's a lot of beautiful moments about feeling that somebody's saying the wrong thing or like feeling. I think so much art. I feel there is what the art to me resides.
In the cringe.
Well, to feeling that like somebody's saying something that you don't like and you still are there to listen to it, right? It's like, like I feel like there's gonna be something there, right? That like, but also it's like thinking out loud, right? And I think this idea like we all have cringy thoughts or like the wrong thoughts, and then we claim that they're only bad when other people do it, right? So that made me think about like the voted 8 hours that you edit, right? Because there's something about these people being comfortable with discourse, right? And for that you need a level of education, and so I wonder in the conversation we're talking about racism and class and education, how much that entered into editing 8 hours out, or like how much in that conversation, so the consciousness that you want to have to interpret something that feels normal to you, right? Or something that feels like raw, it can be a good character. So yeah, I wonder most about like how their level of education or their understanding of class enter to play when they're thinking.
I'm not entirely sure. Well, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a level of sort of self-analysis, that's kind of going on. I mean, on the one hand, there's cringy, raw, kind of like really sort of naive and kind of like basic, you think. It seemed uninformed. things that are being said. And then there's also, quite a bit of analysis and sort of self-interpretation and self-analysis that's going on and reflection. And yeah, I'm not sure what you're wondering, like what I edited out, what else happened in the other.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much of Lynch is worth keeping versus how much worth is, the thing that you talk about, ill-informed, where you feel like, oh, this will not lead the piece anywhere because it's just a thought that is not real.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I edited more. It was supposed to be 90 minutes, not 99 minutes, but we were off task a lot. Actually a lot more than it looks even. So there was that. And I mean, in any group, in any kind of, if you've ever been in a process group, if you've ever been in psychoanalysis, I mean, it's sort of Lacan's short session was invented because he found that the patient only got to the thing that needed to be said, like right before the session ended, And it's part of it's part of a kind of defensive mechanism that's at work. And so in editing it, I was able to kind of take those moments that were like usually either the beginning or the end of these 6 meetings where something was, where we were working through and not just sort of stalling. Which is what happens a lot. You had your hand up.
I did a question. Oh, thank you. I think I had formulated it, but then didn't, and maybe I'll just ask it in a messy way. But I was just like ruminating on anxiety as a tool of group dynamics or a way that groups form around anxiety, or you're talking about the anxiety of difference. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about the opposite of that. Like, is there an anti-anxiety or an antithesis to anxiety, a source in which groups could form around other than
anxiety?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, groups don't form. So, I mean, the group relations theory is that all groups come together around a task of some sort. Or if they form, they take up a task. And there are explicit overt tasks, and then there are unconscious tasks. So groups don't form around anxiety, they form around like a task. And even if you get together with friends, your task is to have a good time, to connect with people, to not feel lonely together. So those aren't about anxiety, but that the anxiety emerges, in the existence of the external world, in a certain way, and to different degrees. For different people, and how that emerges. And it is something that I'm emphasizing here because I'm very socially anxious, so that's my experience. But I mean, within the group, the group of this meeting is being recorded group, it was a lot. There were also these longings that are even kind of harder to get to. I mean, if we think of anxiety or indifference as being kind of pushing people apart, there's also anxiety about loss, anxiety about loneliness, anxiety about being expelled from the group, which is also essential to anxiety, just in groups. And in this group, there's this kind of belongings to, intergenerationally here for the kind of caring mother, which then appears like right at the beginning as a sort of mammy-ized black woman. I mean, it was like right there. So, I mean, the dynamics of the group, which, it's like, okay, so there's this intergenerational group of white women, And in this introduction, what's triggered immediately are kind of mother-daughter transferences, anxieties, and longings, and those immediately get projected onto these sort of the good, bad mother, longings, anxieties, good, bad mother, immediately get split and projected onto these two classic figures of Black women. They get racialized in that way immediately. And that really was the first 15, 20 minutes of the first group. So what we were doing, which is one of the ways that racism and racialization operates, is that to sort of protect ourselves and to protect the cohesion of the group against the anxiety and the threat to the group represented by these longings and fears, we projected them outside of the group onto these other figures. And that is one of the classic mechanisms. And I mean, we might not have projected, those projections might not have taken the shape of Black women if we hadn't had taken up this task. On the other hand, there is a very long institutionalized history of, of Black women being used in that way. By white women, especially the white people. So that's.
Was it all in Minneapolis?
What?
Were they connected to Minneapolis?
No. No. One was in the Midwest, one was in Missouri, one was in Boston or Massachusetts. Two were in Massachusetts. One was in New York, one was in Los Angeles. So we were pretty spread out. And two were from the South. And they wanted to have an accent that sort of but,
I think one more question. I have the last question. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor to meet you. And I really admire your work of basically like taking a real conversation, condensing, making a script, walking with it, embodying it. And I'm really interested in the aspect of language in that process. And I'm wondering if, like, after all this time, if there are any specific phrases or words from the script that, like, haunt you or follow you.
it would probably all come back to me pretty quickly, but I think I have repressed a lot. I mean, one thing that I think that comes to me, and something but it's, and one of the women, this one, said something about how scary it is to, to look at parts of oneself that one really doesn't like at all. And, that's pretty fundamental. I mean, there's something that's so kind of concise about recognizing the fear, the difficulty of that. And what happens when one avoids that and defends against it, which is the sort of the alternative that we try to work through, which again is something that I think is very, historically is part of the mechanism, behind racialized projections. So, I love the language and working with transcripts. So, I mean, this kind of goes back to acting too, since you asked about language, because I really work through, language, and language is primary for me, and I memorize it, it's a muscle memory, and it's like an embodiment, but it's this really, for me, I think some of these performances especially the last couple that are more naturalistic, or at least I'm just trying to achieve a more naturalistic acting, is the tension between, you know, I wouldn't be able to achieve that without a transcript, without language that's really very real. And in fact, I edited the audio. I did the paper edit and then I edited the audio, and I had an audio track that I used. So I wouldn't have been able to achieve that performance without these tools. But the kind of tension between, you know, hopefully the sort of naturalist kind of acting that sort of draws you in somehow, in some way, hopefully, to a kind of an emotional experience. And at the same time, you know, I'm not 7 women, you know, and I'm not trying to, there's not an effort to like, that you should suspend this belief that I'm 7 women. So, you know, what happens between those and how that then relates to the subject matter, right? So part of that is, one woman says at one point, you know, white people don't like to be thought of as a group. We want to think of ourselves as individuals. We take a resistance to sort of racialization. And so, but here I am, 7 white women. I mean, that I'm kind of embodying this sort of racialized, gendered, you know, category in that way. And that's part of, I think, what is maybe being worked through, or at least help in some way. In least that actually feels totally off topic. Down another road.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface, but thank you so much for this very, very rich piece. Thank you for bringing us together.